Colombia's first socialist president, Gustavo Petro, has announced he wants to officially end the war on drugs. And this is substantial because the US has spent billions of dollars fighting the war on drugs in Colombia. But they failed to combat the drug trade in any way, and the DEA has begun acting as an arm of US imperialism in Latin America. Venezuela and Bolivia both kicked the DEA out of their countries and found that the agency was spying on them. They've also been more successful in curbing drug abuse since the DEA left. So if Colombia, the country who Hugo Chavez once called the Israel of Latin America, were able to get rid of the DEA and US military presence, it would be huge for Latin America combating US imperialism overall. In conjunction with Honduras, who's going through something similar right now, and hopefully giving Bolsonaro the boot in Brazil. Lots of good stuff going on in Latin America. They're becoming wise to imperialism's ploys. Colombia's
So yeah, it's great to hear Petro say he wanted to follow. I mean, he wanted to end the drug war. Hopefully, he follows through. There's a lot of these things like McCarthyism, the Red Scare, the drug war that like we think are only things in North America, that were only things in the United States, but the U.S. and the CIA particularly really outsourced these things to Central America and Latin America via all sorts of hybrid war techniques and what's now called Operation Condor. So one of the things that they've done is try and enforce the drug war, especially in Colombia. So that means you have all sorts of federal agents, DEA agents running around in Latin America. And of course, the U.S. is going to use that for imperialism. How could they help themselves? So when Venezuela and Bolivia kicked the DEA out of their countries and searched what was left behind and investigated, they found, of course, that the DEA was spying on them. The DEA was spying on all the socialist parties. They were influencing Latin American politics. And actually, recently there were articles revealing that DEA agents were collaborating with the Colombian drug dealers and making a bunch of money, which is similar to the corruption that was going on in Afghanistan, where you had U.S. military officials making tons and tons of money off of opium, oftentimes harvested by Afghans who they would, pay not much or even, offer like a green card in return for cheap labor. So yeah. Hopefully Petro follows through. That's the key, especially with these elected socialists. Will they follow through? What exactly are they going to pursue in terms of policies? But I gotta imagine this is popular. I gotta imagine not many people in Colombia are a big fan of the DEA being there and claiming to fight this drug war while the drug trade and drug violence is getting worse. And that's it. Sorry, last thing, Venezuela and Bolivia have been more successful in curbing drug abuse and addiction since the DEA left, which should tell you everything you need to know about the so-called war on drugs.
Right, right. The imperialists name things in a way that's completely upside down. They call democracy a rule where only a small percentage of people, the wealthiest billionaires in society, control what's done. They call the war on drugs the institutions and state apparatuses which promote drug trade and destroy communities. But there's a few things that I wanted to say about this Gustavo Petro speech. When he first got elected, I remember we had a conversation with Comrade Yamir and Comrade Libre. I think both of which had been in Colombia in basically canvassing it and working for the Petro campaign. And there was at the same time some doubts that were being raised about Petro, some potential connections to the Clinton Foundation, some things he said about Venezuela, some things he said about China. And that was being contrasted to this image that was being pushed by both progressive forces and the right in order to attack him, of him being a guerrilla warrior that was a communist, etc., etc. And so I remember we had this interview with these guys that were active in the process of struggling for Petro's election, And at that point, I wasn't like fully sold. I was still open to it. And when I saw um, how deeply the people involved in the process, communists who I respect and know are not like sellouts or anything like that. When I saw how much they appreciated Petro and how historic of a moment it actually was, I felt a little safer. But he still hadn't grabbed power. He still hadn't basically acted in the ways that he was talking. And what we've seen ever since he's gotten into power is him fulfilling a lot of the actions that he was saying. And I know this speech at the UN is just a speech, but it's a pretty darn good speech, and it's historic in many levels, right? Most presidents that you heard speak, they have a little paper in front of them. They're looking at the paper. They're reading sentence by sentence. They're nervous. Gustavo Petro was up there like a fucking baller, right? He was not looking at the paper. He was talking very emotionally. It was a wonderful speech, and he was calling out the U.S. He was calling out NATO. He was calling out the dominant order of things, an order that's dominated by capital and that destroys both human lives and the life of the planet. He gave a fantastic speech. Look, I listened to the speeches um, from the president of Bolivia. I listened to the speech from AMLO. I listened to a few of the speeches, and none of them was able to move me as much as this one. He was calling them out to their face in a beautiful way. No need to read from the paper. And I think that means something, especially in the context of the renewed relations that he's been establishing with Venezuela. I think that Petro is not going to have the outcome that like Gabriel Boric had, who condemned at the UN speech Nicaragua and Cuba and Russia. I think Petro is going to be someone who sticks to his ideals, which are more so of a soft socialist slash the social democrat form of environmentalism that is largely opposed to imperial. Like his critique of the drug war was absolutely superb because it captured all the levels of it. It captured how it affects Colombians, it captured how it affects the region, it captured how it affects working class communities in our country, and disproportionately black and brown communities that are completely destroyed by the war on drugs, that have been disproportionately thrown into prison over it in a country that has 25% of the world's prison population while only having 4% of the population in general. So I think it's not just a symbolic speech, it's something that has substance behind it. And it's really exciting because I was still on the limbo. Is he going to be at least somewhat of a social democrat? And social democracy in Latin America is usually much more radical than like the pro-NATO social democrats in Europe, right? Um, I think Venezuela is sort of like a social democracy, and they're a strong anti-imperialist force in the anti-imperialist camp. And I'm hoping that Petro, from what I've seen so far, is going to end up taking a similar route.
Yeah. Going back to what Troika Collective said, talking about organizing in Colombia, it's similar to like a Bernie. As socialists or communists, you root for Bernie to win or you organize for him. But had Bernie won, we didn't know, what he was actually going to do in office, what he was going to fight for. He might have turned around and, taken the Democrat line on Ukraine and started dumping a bunch of weapons into Ukraine. And I mean, that's what him and AOC and the squad have done from Congress. So who's to say he wouldn't do that from the executive office? But it's better than the far right wingers, and even Gabriel Boric in Chile has been a huge disappointment. Has better than having like a fascist in power. So it's a risk that you take when organizing for people, but like we organized for Bernie, which was a lot of work and took a lot of effort, and a lot of time. It was a commitment. But they were telling us, the Troika Collective guys, that people organizing for Petro were risking their lives. They were getting shot at. there are right-wing paramilitaries in Colombia. The U.S. military is crawling all over Colombia, and there's very little oversight. So these people were literally risking their lives just to try and win an election. So yeah, you see, I don't know. It's hard to not have solidarity with them in that struggle, and root for Petro and hope that he, is better than Boric, and some of his contemporaries. And so far, he has been. So yeah, good sign. Oh, let's watch this video actually from the International. Subscribe to the International. They're having a subscription campaign right now. Great website based in India.
Por ocultar la verdad, verán morir la selva y las democracias. La guerra contra las drogas ha fracasado. La lucha contra la crisis climática ha fracasado. Han aumentado los consumos mortales de drogas suaves, han pasado a las más duras. Se ha producido un genocidio en mi continente y en mi país han condenado a las cárceles a millones de personas. Para ocultar sus propias culpas sociales, le han echado la culpa a la selva y sus plantas. Han llenado de sinrazón los discursos y las políticas. Yo les demando desde aquí, desde mi Latinoamérica herida, acabar con la irracional guerra contra las drogas. Disminuir el consumo de drogas no necesita de guerras, de armas. Necesita que todos construyamos una mejor sociedad, una sociedad más solidaria.
You want to comment on that, Carlos? I got to run to the bathroom quick, but
Yeah, that was great. His comments on, I think, climate change were the most poignant, specifically because he's combating the idea that that climate change is just this generalized phenomenon that has been driven by humans in general. And he's very explicit about the fact that it's a system, right? It's the capitalist system, which we know has constant crisis of overproduction, that promotes an endless amount of consumption, an endless amount of production without any regard to human needs. Just to give a short story, my parents, part of how they've been able to eat lately has been through food drives that the church does, where the stores have the things that are about to expire. They give it to the church for free. Not for free. They give it to the church, and then the church give it out to people for free. Now the companies get tax deductions from it, so that's the only real reason why they've done that. But those activities are being eliminated because it's not helpful for the market if people are able to get stuff for free. So you have a condition where there's overproduction, where capitalism makes too many things, and overproduction is not determined around need, right? It's a relative standard. It's not a standard that's related to how much human need there is. It's a standard that's related to how much there is at a specific moment in order to buy, how many people are capable of buying things, and it overproduces. And even though there's people experiencing hunger, 1 in 8 children in the US experience hunger, food will continuously be thrown away. And I believe 40 tons of food in the US gets thrown out every year. That's about 40% of the food in the US getting thrown out. And 1 in 8 children experience hunger. 35 million adults experience hunger. And that's the crisis of capitalism. That's the crisis of overproduction, which it purports and it proliferates, as Petro's saying, a system that is fundamentally irrational, right? It doesn't make any sense to have on one end people that are hungry and on the other end surplus food being thrown out. It doesn't make any sense to have on one end people that are homeless, that are even dying from homelessness, especially in the winter in the Midwest and in the north of the United States. And then on the other hand, to have uninhabited homes, right? That doesn't make any sense, but those are the conditions that arise out of capitalism from its moments of crisis, from the basic contradictions in the embryo of the system.